Let's begin with a word of prayer. Amen. Greetings, everyone. Okay, so we've come to the final study in this series. And we have a lot to cover today. So we will go straight into it. I'll finish off our consideration of the history that we've been going through. And then in the next part, we'll come to a consideration of this book. The Turnaway Study, in the time that we have left. Okay, so we left off having looked at the progression of the anti-choice movement. And we looked at some of the victories that they had gained. The victories that they had gained that bring us to the present. And we came down to the Trump administration. And for time's sake, we'll focus on one particular aspect of the Trump administration. Which is his judicial appointments. Of course, we discussed at length how capturing the judiciary was central to the radical right strategy. And Trump was the one who put the seal on that. So a little over a week after taking office, Trump nominated Neil Gorsuch to fill the Supreme Court. He was nominated to fill a seat that Obama should have filled. But that Mitch McConnell had held hostage for a year. During his campaign, Trump had promised to nominate someone in the mold of the late Antonin Scalia. Antonin Scalia. And Antonin Scalia was the far-right justice who helped mold the Federalist Society from its beginning. And Gorsuch was the perfect fit. He came up through the Federalist Society's networks. And was listed as one of their experts before being nominated. And he is a proponent of the originalist method of interpreting the Constitution. which focused solely on interpreting the language of the Constitution as it was understood at the time it was written, denying the relevance of any cultural change or real-life consequences to hardline judicial decisions. So Neil Gorsuch, according to our chart, he was nominated in 2017. The next appointment I want to bring to our attention is a court case that came about the following year after Gorsuch's nomination. After Gorsuch's nomination. This was this case of the NIFLA versus Becerra in June 2018. All right, so just add some of these names to this list that we've been populating. Okay, so what was this case about? One of the things that the anti-choice organizations did to place obstacles in the way of women seeking abortions they would establish these fake women's health centers across the country. Women's health centers that gave the impression that they provided abortion services. Meanwhile, they did not provide abortion services. They would lure women in who were seeking the service. And once they had brought them in, they would subject them to propaganda. To anti-abortion propaganda. To try to scare them out of their decision. So anti-choice organizations had been operating such centers countrywide. But in California, a law was passed which required these fake women's centers to post signs saying that abortion services were available in the state, even though they're not offered at that center. And these anti-choice organizations sued. And in a highly divisive 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court was split. But the anti-choice organizations won. This case affirmed the right of these centers to lie to women. To lie to them in the name of free speech. So there was a Justice Anthony Kennedy. He was considered the one in the middle. He was considered the swing vote. And he sided with the conservative wing to give them the victory in this case. And Justice Kennedy would resign 2 days after this case. And this paved the way for Trump to replace him with Brett Kavanaugh. Brett Kavanaugh, who was nominated in July of 2018. Now, Brett Kavanaugh, he met the litmus test of opposition to Roe versus Wade. As a former White House lawyer under George Bush, George W. Bush, he openly challenged the idea that Roe was the settled law of the land. And there is only one actual case that he ruled in, which was viewed as an indication of how he would treat the abortion issue. In October 2017, a teenage woman had crossed into the United States the previous month. And she found out she was pregnant. She knew immediately that she wanted an abortion. And Kavanaugh was part of a 3-judge panel that ruled to delay her abortion. And his argument was, the other judges were trying to create a new law. Or a new right for illegal immigrant women to obtain abortion in the United States. And in his statements, he used language that came out of John C. Wilkes' handbook. And you remember John C. Wilkes was the father of anti-choice disinformation. The decision was eventually reversed by an appeals court. And the woman received her abortion. But again, this was the only abortion-related case he was involved in before his nomination. And it caused concern for people worried about civil rights. But it increased his support with the radical right in the Republican Party. A bit more about Kavanaugh. The state of Louisiana. Oh, and this is an opportunity to correct a misstatement I made in a previous presentation. I had mentioned that Louisiana only has one abortion clinic. It actually only has 3. And a proposed law was going to reduce it to just one doctor in the entire state who could provide that service. And that's what we're coming to now. So there's this concept called a trap legislation. Let me put it in our list. Trap legislation. And TRAP stands for Targeted Regulation of Abortion Providers. So these are laws that are passed to make it more difficult for abortion providers to make it more difficult for them to operate and force them to shut down. And state governments with long-standing Republican Party control tend to be where you see a lot of such legislation being passed. So in 2019, the state of Louisiana, which has 4.6 million people, it only had 3 abortion clinics. In February of that year, the Supreme Court voted to block a Louisiana law a law that would have reduced the number of doctors able to perform abortion to just 1. And Kavanaugh expressed support for the decision. Kavanaugh expressed support for the law. Right? He made statements to the, in support of that law. So his statements on this case, as well as his handling of the case of that migrant woman, is viewed by many as a clear indication of his hostility to Roe versus Wade. Then we come to Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You remember she passed away in September of 2020. And of course, she was a champion of equality throughout her career. But after she passed, Trump nominated Amy Coney Barrett to replace her. So we're going to speak a bit about Amy Coney Barrett. She was nominated on the 26th of September. (2020). Amy Coney Barrett herself is a former member of the Federalist Society. And during her confirmation hearing, she said very little that could have been used against her. Because something that the Federalist Society actively does it coaches its potential appointees. In how to get through the confirmation process as smoothly as possible. Without exposing perspectives that may prove to be a stumbling block to their confirmation. And I remember listening to her confirmation, and she said nothing. She was able to very carefully, navigate through the questions that were being put to her. So, as with Kavanaugh, the best way people have been, the best guess people have as to her philosophy, as to how she thinks, is drawn from looking at her past history. When you look at Amy Coney Barrett's past history, there was a lot of information in the media about her involvement in an ultra-conservative Christian group. A group characterized by a very strict patriarchal hierarchy. And some of the women, who've come out of that group have had to undergo therapy for years. To recover from the trauma that they endured in that community. But beyond that, there was a clue in her actual confirmation hearing. where she admitted that she did not see Roe versus Wade as a case that formed a super precedent. And a super precedent is a precedent that the Supreme Court cannot overrule. So we come to the present, and 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices have ties to the Federalist Society. And you remember, conservative positions as well as opposition to Roe versus Wade. Conservative positions as well as opposition to Roe versus Wade was and is a litmus test to be part of the Federal Society. So the current circumstance has created a context where the Federalist Society is now one of the most influential legal organizations in history. Not only shaping law students' thinking, but changing American society itself by shifting the Supreme Court to the right. So if we come back to our chart, in March of 2021, I identified Bill 6 in Arkansas. All right, so in March of this year, Bill 6 passed in the Arkansas legislature. I think it goes without saying that Arkansas has a long-standing conservative majority. In its legislature. And Bill 6 is a trap bill. And what it proposed to do, what it does is it makes performing abortions a criminal offense. That can be punished with 10 years in prison or a fine of $100,000. Or both 10 years in prison and a fine of $100,000. And it does not allow for exceptions in the cases of rape, incest, or severe fetal abnormalities. Right? And it's a really extreme piece of legislation. And the sponsor of the bill has admitted that they made it so extreme on purpose. So it would lead to a legal challenge that would reach the Supreme Court. And of course, right now on the Supreme Court, the conservatives have a majority. There's a majority of judges who oppose Roe versus Wade. So they want this case to reach the Supreme Court, where they're hoping the Roe versus Wade would be overturned. So women's reproductive rights, as far as their ability to obtain abortions are concerned, are really under threat in the United States. But I'll call us to remember that Roe versus Wade does not really have to be overturned. Because you have all this legislation being passed at the state level that is designed to hollow out the provisions of Roe versus Wade. So you have Roe versus Wade, which grants the right to access abortion. But in the States, you have all these laws being passed, calculated to make it harder to access that right. Right? It's part of the subtlety that characterizes this dispensation. Okay, so we've essentially come to the end of our consideration of the history. And I think one thing should be clear at this point. Which essentially is, if you view the subject of abortion through a binary moralistic right or wrong lens, you've likely received that framing of the issue from the religious right, from religious and political conservatives. All right, so that's an important consideration when we go back and consider and look at this through the lens of the two streams. So now we're going to change over to something else. We're going to look at the Turnaway Study. So the Turnaway Study was the first of its kind. To investigate how abortion affects women. And it compares women who get an abortion with women who want an abortion but are denied. Previous studies compared women who had abortions with women who gave birth regardless of whether they wanted an abortion in the first place. And the problem with this comparison is women are more likely to choose to give birth when times are good, when they're in good relationships, when they're financially stable, and when they feel ready to support a child. And women are more likely to choose to have an abortion when times are not so good, when relationships are rocky, when their health status is poor, when they don't have enough money to support themselves. So comparing women who have abortions with those who give birth, it says more about the woman's circumstances and whether the pregnancy was wanted than it does about the actual experience of abortion and what follows from it. All right, so I hope that makes sense. A bit of context for the study. In 1987, Ronald Reagan addressed leaders of the anti-choice movement. And he promised to overturn Roe versus Wade. As part of his strategy for overturning Roe versus Wade, he sought to gather enough data to prove that abortion harms women. However, his Surgeon General, right, the Surgeon General in his administration, who was also anti-choice, he wrote to Reagan saying, "I'm sorry to inform you, but in spite of a diligent review by many in the public health service, and by many in the private sector, the scientific studies do not provide conclusive data about the health effects of abortion on women." And he called for more research to be done. What he called for specifically was a 5-year study analyzing all the many outcomes of sex and reproduction. But this call was unfulfilled for over 20 years. Until, of course, Dr. Diana Green Foster began the work of what would become the Turnaway Study. The women who agreed to participate in the Turnaway Study they closely resemble the profile of the women who seek abortions nationally. And the data in the study answers many assumptions. Many assumptions, people tend to have about this subject and the women involved. And what I've done is that I've just drawn pieces of information from parts of the book. Which answers some of these questions and assumptions. But I'll definitely say right away that in the time that we have, we cannot really do justice to the information in this study. One would have to either read the book or listen to Diana Green Foster's lecture series on YouTube. She has a lecture series where she presents the data that's in the book. So people who oppose abortion often accuse women seeking abortions of being misinformed, irresponsible, or amoral. However, the study found that women make very thoughtful decisions about whether to have an abortion, and the fears and concerns that they express tend to be confirmed by the outcomes that follow when they're denied. Okay, and the Turnaway Study is also helpful because it does something we won't have time to do. Which is at the beginning and end of each chapter. Right? Each chapter is presenting data. But at the beginning and end of each chapter, there's a story. There's a story of an actual woman. A real life story of a woman who was in the situation that is being covered in that chapter. So I found that very helpful because it helped illuminate the type of situations that happen. And where, if you really put yourself in that person's shoes, you will see, really how harmful the sort of, narrow, binary, moralistic anti-choice position is. Okay, so the first question that we will seek to answer is, why do women have abortions? So I have a chart to share. Reasons women seek abortion. So 2/3 of the women reported gave multiple reasons for wanting to end their pregnancies. Most women reported financial reasons. Stating that they already didn't have enough money to pay for basic living expenses like food, housing, and transportation. So, you think practically. If someone is struggling to support themselves, and they are forced to bring that child into the world, what would be the outcome for that woman as well as that child's life? Some women reported that it was the wrong time. Like one story that's covered of a woman by the name of Jessica. She fell pregnant 5 months after having a child. And she was also experiencing deteriorating health. And her relationship with her husband was deteriorating as well. She just couldn't manage another child. And she decided to have an abortion. Right? So these are the sort of real life situations that that people find themselves in, with almost impossible circumstances and no support. And you can see how, if you're coming at such a person with judgment regarding with moralistic judgment, how you would not be helping that situation, you'd be doing more damage to that person. Bad relationships with men, they represent another common reason women seek to end a pregnancy. Many were in relationships that they did not feel were stable enough to support a child. Or to support another child. Right? And contrary to how people tend to think, having a child did not help those women in unstable relationships. Having a child did not help to preserve the relationship. within 2 years, more than half of the women in the study had broken up with the man involved in the pregnancy. This is important because it disproves that assumption about having the child helping to preserve the relationship. In a situation where the relationship is unhealthy when the child is conceived. Right. It's also important because people who believe abortion is wrong also tend to be uncomfortable with children being raised in broken homes. Or single parent households. Right. So you really create an impossible situation for someone. If you're approaching this through a really conservative lens. It's like there's condemnation and judgment at every corner. And it's also important to note that, when we view such situations, of a woman who seeks an abortion with the reason that the relationship was not stable enough, I'll say from my experience that the men involved in these situations tend to escape judgment. Okay, so 60% of the women, 60% of the women in the study were already mothers. And I don't know if you had any assumptions about that, right? But the majority of women seeking abortions are already mothers. At least, of course, this is within the context of the United States. And they reported wanting the abortion to be able to better take care of the children they already had. Right. So one story covered in the book was maybe the first one actually, was of a woman who had a daughter with her husband. And they only just managed to provide well for her daughter. They were able to give her a good life and expose her to many opportunities. But financially, it really strained them. They were living on the edge, basically. And having a second child would have driven them into poverty. And severely drawn back the opportunities available, that they would have been able to give their first daughter. So when she felt pregnant a second time, she decided to have an abortion. right? Another story, one 31-year-old woman, 31-year-old woman, reported that her 10-year-old son was diagnosed with cancer. And she needed to drive 10 hours for his treatments. And when she felt pregnant again, she aborted that pregnancy in order to focus on her sick son. Right? So these are the many, really complex stories. Like, what do you want people to do? Right? I think you start to see the cruelty of a really, rigid, moralistic position on this subject. Many reported that having a baby would have derailed their life plans or their career goals. Women who received an abortion were more likely to stay employed. And to live above the federal poverty line. Politicians and anti-choice activists have argued that abortion hurts women. That it is harmful to mental health and will likely cause depression. But for almost 20% of the women, a concern about their mental health was actually what led them to seek the abortion in the first place. Okay, so we're just working through this list. Right. 1 in 8 women in the study chose to end a pregnancy due to concerns about their own health. And 5% of the women chose abortion because of alcohol, tobacco, or drug use. Use of these substances at the very beginning of their pregnancy. Right? Some women partake of these things before they realize they're pregnant, especially when they weren't trying to conceive. So they realize down the road that they've been carrying a baby. Then there's a fear that that pregnancy may have been compromised by their alcohol or tobacco use. Another assumption, the idea that women are pressured into abortion it looms large in the public imagination. And it has been used to justify a whole range of laws. Such as mandatory waiting periods before receiving abortion, or mandatory counseling. The study found that only 5% of the women said family or friends played a part in their decision. And only 1% actually reported pressure from family or friends as their reason. So, the question, why do women seek abortions? The answer is many reasons, right? Many reasons, and sometimes multiple reasons. And, what's being considered is the best interest of the woman herself. In the context of many other factors. So it really becomes inappropriate from a level of Christian compassion to approach women, confronted with this decision, really with anything other than empathy and encouragement. Right? People are just trying to make the best decisions that they can in the face of, complex circumstances. Okay, so another question. Why are women becoming pregnant if they don't want to have a baby? And this is another question around which there are many judgments. Around women supposedly neglecting to use contraception. I don't know if in your lives, I know I've heard this type of reasoning. Where you hear someone fall pregnant and people are like, why didn't they just use contraception? But if you really look at the big picture of it, consistently using contraception from the first time having sex to menopause and only taking a break to conceive maybe 1 or 2 children. That's quite a feat. There's a second chart I'll show us here. I hope you can see that. Most unintended pregnancies in the United States are caused by gaps in contraceptive use. Right. I will read from a page in the book. I can find it. Okay, here we are. So, as I already stated, consistently using contraception from the first time having sex to menopause and taking time to gestate maybe 1 or 2 intended pregnancies. It's a major endeavor. It's a major endeavor. It's a major effort. Contraception is expensive for one, and it requires a lot of diligence and forethought. And in many cases, tolerance of side effects. And so, the study, it gives this estimate where, if you take a hypothetical woman, she becomes sexually active at 18, and starts menopause around 45, have 2 kids between 18 and 45 when she is ready. She would have to take 6,844 contraceptive pills. Use condoms every time for perhaps 2,000 acts of intercourse. Replace 975 patches if the patch is her method of contraception. Or replace 325 vaginal rings. Right? And all of this has to be done in a timely fashion. And all of this would have to be done in a timely fashion. So you see, over the course of a lifetime, that just leaves a lot of room for things to go wrong. And most unintended pregnancies in the US, as I said, they're not caused by contraceptive failure, they're caused by gaps in use of contraception. And the book makes the point that even for a woman who uses contraceptives consistently, there would still be a significant chance of becoming pregnant. Over a reproductive lifetime, she might become pregnant as many as 2 times on the pill, 4 times with condoms, and 7 using withdrawal. right? So, you know, when you view someone who falls pregnant in an unintended pregnancy, and you want to have all these judgments about their, whether they're being responsible or not. I think when you view the bigger picture, you see that there's just so much that could happen even when someone is trying. Right? So that's why at the clinical and policy level, or rather, before I come to that, making all of this worse, uh, is the fact that many women report having trouble accessing contraceptives. Right? 1 in 5 reported that they ran out of contraceptive supplies before becoming pregnant. That is why, when it comes to policy, it's important to make contraceptive methods easy to access. But again, many who feel abortion is wrong also tend to have a level of discomfort about various forms of contraception. Okay, so in the time that we have left, I'm just going to have to pick and choose the questions that we look at. Um, we'll look at the question of women's health. A common assumption is that abortion is dangerous. That mortality following abortions is high and needs to be regulated closely. Okay, so to put this in perspective, complications only occur in 2% of abortions in the United States. And again, to put it in perspective, this is lower than the risk of wisdom tooth extraction. Which carries, 7%, which has a measure of 7% of complications arising from that. A tonsillectomy has 8 to 9% of complications arising from that process. And childbirth itself, and giving birth to a child, has 29% rate of complications arising from it. So if you put it in perspective, having an abortion is less dangerous than giving birth to a child. And that's just the data. Right? When we speak of major complications, that's complications needing surgery, a blood transfusion, or hospitalization, it's less than 0.25% for abortion, right? And, you can, and for women with chronic health conditions, all right, so what the study that does that it then contrasts this with childbirth, and shows how giving birth to a child is it's actually a more dangerous process. Okay, let's look at women's lives briefly. An analysis was conducted of how having an abortion affected women's ability to realize a one-year life plan. Sorry, I'm just taking a moment to quickly skim through the comment section. Um, okay, yeah, I'll just continue for time. All right, so this analysis of women's plans looked at plans with goals that were measurable. And it categorized the plans into three categories. The first was aspirational, which included goals such as having a better job or staying in school. The second category was neutral, which included, plans that, like the kids will be older. And the third category was negative, which included things like, I will probably have less money. So most of the women had lots of plans for their lives. Most of them multiple plans. And most of them, over 80% of them, were aspirational. But women who were denied abortions were less likely to have an aspirational plan for the coming year. Right? You have 86 for those who received abortions and 56 for those who were denied. In other words, denying women abortions, it caused them to severely scale back their plans for their lives. While allowing women to have wanted abortions, allowed them to set more aspirational plans for their futures. This communicates that the time in life when many women seek abortion it's a really pivotal time when they're setting life goals and making important decisions. and denying women in these positions, access to abortion, it can really affect their life trajectory. Right. So, the implications there when we think of, equality. And women having an equal playing field to plan and work for their futures. The final point I'll touch on is about children. An unwanted pregnancy carried to term it affects the well-being of the existing children in the family. Remember, over 60% of the women seeking abortions already have children. Right? But, carrying to term an unwanted pregnancy, it affects existing children because resources such as money, time, and the parents' attention these are fixed resources. And the more children there are, the less any one of them will receive. Right? When there's already not enough, because again, most of the women seeking abortions are in financially unstable situations. So when there's already not enough to go around, one more mouth to feed, one more body in need of holding and protection, one more mind to nurture, may really be more than the parents can provide for. They used a measure to track the development milestones of a child. And they looked at the development of the children whose mothers received a subsequent abortion versus the development outcomes of children whose mothers were denied a subsequent abortion, denied an abortion later, yeah? And these development milestones looked at 6 areas. Such as receptive language, expressive language, motor skills, self-help, social and emotional development, and the children of the mothers who received an abortion for a later pregnancy did better than the children of the mothers who were denied. Okay, so we've come to the end of the study. And I'll reiterate that, we've not been able to do this book justice. We've just touched on a few of its findings. But to summarize its findings, there was no evidence that abortion hurts women. For every outcome analyzed, women who received an abortion were either the same or more frequently better off than women who were denied an abortion. Their physical health was better. Their mental health was initially better than the same. I'll make a point about mental health. Because the majority of the women, over 90%, communicated that abortion was the right decision for them, and they were relieved to have received it. But of the smaller percentage who reported that abortion was a very difficult decision, accompanied by a lot of a very difficult decision, and that it wasn't right for them after the fact. These women also reported, their judgment from the communities that they come from as being a significant issue. So it's true that some women do experience a lot of emotional distress in connection with the decision to have an abortion. But you have to think a lot of it is associated with societal stigma and how it is viewed in their communities, and how they feel they will be viewed in their communities. Women who received abortions had more aspirational plans for their lives and for the coming year. They had a greater chance of having a wanted pregnancy in a stable relationship down the road. Carrying unwanted pregnancies to term hurts women in many ways. It was associated with significant health risks in some instances. It's associated with economic hardships. Women denied abortions are more likely to live in poverty. And women's children do worse on several measures of health and development. When they carry an unwanted pregnancy to term. Okay, so as we close, I hope this series has given you food for thought. On so many things, we really need to reconsider and reevaluate our thinking. Particularly as we are being prepared to minister to both Levites and Nephilim. Let's consider where our perspective comes from. And let's consider how we will both view and treat the women that we come across in our lives who are confronted with this circumstance, with this decision. Right, and even the women in this movement who confronted with this decision. Okay, so I'd like to thank you all for your time. It's been a blessed week. Let's close with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for your word. We thank you for educating us. We thank you for the wisdom that you are imparting, which, Lord, should translate to love for others. Which should translate to treating them how you would treat them. And Lord, it's the day of preparation. Please help us to be ready for the Sabbath. And for all of us who are already in the Sabbath, may you bless its sacred hours. Please hear us in all these things. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for your time, everyone. It's been a blessing.